Introduction. About me and my family. My name is Jenny Carter, and I am 34 years old. I live in a quiet corner of Maplewood, a small suburb nestled on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, my life might look like something out of a magazine. Tree-lined streets, neighbors that wave as you walk by, and the comforting hum of children playing in the yards during late summer evenings. But like most stories worth telling, there's much more simmering beneath the surface. I've been a single mother for nearly 6 years now, ever since Emily was just a toddler. Emily is 8 years old and the absolute light of my life. She's got this wild, curly brown hair that refuses to stay tied up, and the kind of laugh that can make the darkest day seem a little brighter. She's fiercely independent, but still sneaks into my bed on thunderstormy nights, clutching her frayed pink bunny for comfort. Every time I look at her, I see pieces of myself. My stubbornness, my quick wit, and maybe a shade of my cautious optimism. Before Emily, I worked hard to build a career I could be proud of. I put myself through law school at Ohio State, juggling 3 part-time jobs, late nights full of textbooks and coffee, and the kind of doubt that so often follows women chasing ambitions in a man's world. When I finally passed the bar, I felt unstoppable. I joined a respected law firm in the city, starting out at the bottom, but determined to climb. Long days in the office and late nights prepping for trials became normal, but I loved it. The law, with all its intricacies and logic, made sense to me. Fighting for justice, advocating for the little guy, those were more than just duties. They were passions. Being a mother changed me, though. Priorities shifted. Now, I wake up a little earlier each day to pack a lunchbox with Emily's favorites: strawberry jelly sandwiches, carrot sticks, a little note tucked in the corner to remind her she's loved. Mornings in our home are a careful dance. Me rushing between the kitchen and bathroom, Emily peppering me with questions about school, or asking if she can do soccer again this fall. Our life isn't perfect, but it's ours, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. My own parents, now retired, live 2 hours away in Cincinnati. They visit often, mostly to spoil Emily or sneak me homemade casseroles when work gets overwhelming. I think they worry about me, about how much I carry alone. But they also know I'm stubborn, maybe a touch too stubborn for my own good. That tenacity, though, is what got me this far. At the end of the day, everything I do is for Emily. My dreams go beyond personal success. I want to build something steady, loving, and secure for her. To teach her, not just by words, but by example, how to stand up for what's right, how to dust yourself off after a fall, and how family is woven not just by blood, but by the choices we make every day to show up, fight, and care for one another. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life in Maplewood might seem ordinary to some, but for us, it's full of resilience, small victories, and, most importantly, unwavering hope for what tomorrow will bring. The beginning of the crisis. Life has a funny way of shifting from ordinary to chaotic in the blink of an eye. For years, I prided myself on balancing the never-ending demands of motherhood in the high-stakes world of legal practice. I thought I'd seen my share of setbacks and tough days, but nothing could have prepared me for how fast the ground would fall from beneath my feet. It started subtly, small signs, a chill in the office air that I hadn't noticed before. Little things about my daily routine began to change in quiet but unsettling ways. Coffee breaks felt a bit shorter when colleagues drifted into hushed conversations as I approached. Meetings grew tense, with my name being mentioned less. My suggestions weighed more critically. I tried to brush it off as just stress or office politics, but a nagging sense of anxiety trailed me everywhere. At the heart of all this was Jack Miller. Once upon a time, Jack and I had been more than just colleagues. We'd wound up dating for almost a year. Intelligent, driven, charming when he wanted to be. Jack held a certain magnetism that could light up a room, but also a darkness he kept carefully hidden. After we broke things off, we made an uneasy truce for professionalism's sake. Or so I thought. I didn't see the trap forming until I was already caught in it. Jack became distant, yet somehow always present at key moments in the office. He'd copy bosses on innocuous emails, raising questions about work I'd already completed. He offered to help with projects, only to later point out mistakes or missed deadlines. Issues, I swear, were fixed before he got involved. Even more troubling, confidential client files disappeared from my desk, only to reappear with subtle changes. It was a gauntlet of workplace sabotage, but so carefully orchestrated that it appeared as if I was simply losing my edge. The worst part wasn't even the professional sabotage. It was the isolation. People I'd counted as friends seemed unsure how to react. Some distanced themselves altogether, while others offered sympathetic smiles, but kept their heads down. I tried talking to HR, but without solid evidence, every complaint sounded like a personal vendetta, or worse, the whining of someone unable to cope under pressure. I felt the walls closing in, my world growing smaller and colder with every passing week. The final blow came suddenly, but almost seemed inevitable. A particularly sensitive case I'd been leading, one that would have cemented my position as partner track at the firm, fell apart when evidence went missing, and a critical deadline was supposedly missed under my watch. The fallout was swift. My competence was called into question, and to my horror, rumors began circulating that my work stress was impacting my ability to parent Emily. The pain was indescribable. It felt like my character, my career, and even my motherhood, core pieces of my identity, were being pulled apart. I felt lost, angry, and betrayed. All my instincts as a lawyer screamed that something was terribly wrong, that none of this was coincidence. But standing alone, with everything on the line, I wondered if I'd have the strength to fight back. That was the beginning of my crisis, a perfect storm that would force me to confront not just Jack, but every fear I'd ever harbored about being a mother, and a professional woman in a ruthless world. The first major setback, losing custody of Emily. There are moments in life when the world seems to tilt off its axis. A letter in the mail, a cold conversation, a legal notice dropped on the kitchen counter. And suddenly, everything you thought was solid starts to crumble. For me, that moment came when I learned I might lose custody of Emily. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of desperation and disbelief. Every fiber of my being screamed that this couldn't be happening. After all those years of sacrifice, late nights curled up with Emily reading fairy tales, after endless hours preparing briefs, every doctor's appointment attended, every scraped knee bandaged, every sandwich lovingly packed with a post-it note. I was now being portrayed as unfit to be her mother, all because of a manufactured cascade of evidence, orchestrated so skillfully by Jack it almost felt unreal. But it was real, painfully so. It started with an official notification. Due to concerns surrounding my work performance and its supposed impact on my ability to parent, the court had scheduled an urgent custody review. I remember standing in the kitchen, hands shaking, as I read the document 3 times over, my coffee untouched, growing cold. Emily was coloring at the table, humming to herself, utterly unaware that the ground beneath both our feet was about to open up. I tried to hold on to hope, tried to believe that the truth would prevail. I gathered my own records, soccer team emails, progress reports from school, a folder full of birthday invitations and hand-drawn cards. I met with my attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Price, who looked at me with steady eyes and said, "You need to prepare for the worst, Jenny." Preparation, as it turned out, couldn't cushion the blow in court. The hearing itself felt more like a public unmasking than a quest for truth. Jack sat across the aisle, immaculate in his suit, voice calm, every word measured. His new girlfriend was there too, playing the sympathetic supporter. He brought forward colleagues I once considered friends. They offered carefully worded statements about my change in demeanor, my preoccupation, and quietly referenced the mistakes that had haunted my recent cases. Some spoke reluctantly, but the die was cast. Jack's legal team presented emails, forwarded and annotated to suggest recklessness or lack of care. They referenced missed deadlines, and one paralegal testified, falsely, I would later learn, that she'd seen me cry at work and neglect calls from the school nurse. It felt as though every human moment of exhaustion, every vulnerability, was being put on display as evidence of incompetence. My voice trembled only once, when the opposing counsel asked if I'd ever prioritized my career over Emily. "Every single thing I do is for my daughter," I answered, perhaps too fiercely. The judge, a middle-aged man known for his impartiality and caution, gave nothing away. For days, I lived suspended between hope and dread, watching Emily play and read and sleep, desperately trying to hide my terror from her small, searching eyes. Night after night, I lay awake, replaying every moment, every decision since the day Emily was born. Could I have been more present? Should I have pushed less at work? Guilt bore down on me, hot and suffocating. The judgment arrived a week later. I remember the envelope, thin, official, no comfort in the weight. I tore it open at the dining table, the same place Emily and I shared pancakes on Saturdays and made Halloween costumes from old t-shirts. The decision devastated me. The judge granted Jack temporary primary custody, pending further review and demonstration of professional stability on my part. My heart shattered. I can't remember exactly how I explained it to Emily. I only recall holding her as she sobbed, her tiny hands curled into my sweater, demanding, "Why can't I stay with you, Mom? Did I do something wrong?" Those were the darkest words I'd ever heard. That first night without her, my home felt silent and monstrous. Her empty room, with its scattered crayons and bookshelf stuffed with animal stories, seemed suddenly alien. I sat on her bed, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny, trying to remember the last thing she'd said to me before leaving with Jack. "Don't forget to water my plant," she'd called, as if afraid even her little succulent would miss her presence. Days blurred into weeks, each one punctuated by awkward exchanges at custody handovers. Emily's reluctant steps toward Jack's car, Jack's unreadable expression. I tried to be strong for Emily, always smiling at drop-off, tucking notes in her backpack, never speaking ill of her father, even when every instinct in me screamed for justice. At night, I lingered by the phone, waiting for her calls. Some nights, she was bubbly and chatty, but on others, all she could manage was a tearful, "I miss you, Mommy." I had to continue working. Law didn't pause for broken hearts. Returning to my office was like entering enemy territory. Everywhere, eyes darted away from mine. Whispers died as I walked past. My once valued opinion was now ignored or treated with thinly veiled suspicion. Even my closest allies grew distant, Wary of being caught in crossfire, I became obsessed with the details of my own case, determined to fight back somehow. Every document Jack had submitted, every statement made by so-called witnesses, I pored over them at night, searching for any thread of truth that might unravel his lies. Grief and anger warred inside me. Some evenings, crushed by the weight of loss, I would drive for hours, windows down, letting the Ohio night air whip tears from my cheeks. But something stronger always stirred beneath the grief, a burning, relentless conviction that Emily needed me and that I would not let this stand. Through it all, my parents called me every night. Mom's gentle voice and Dad's quiet, "Hang in there, Jenny," buoyed me up just as I felt myself sinking. They promised to help any way they could, offering to drive up every weekend, to write letters to character witnesses, to sit with me on nights when the emptiness became too much. And then there was Emily, resilient as sunlight. On the nights she was with me, we tried to maintain our rituals, a puzzle before bed, her favorite macaroni and cheese, whispered plans for the next school play. She was scared, but her trust in me never wavered. She kept her hope alive, and I promised her, over and over, that I would find a way to bring her home. That promise became my anchor. Losing custody of Emily was the lowest valley I had ever known, but it clarified something in my soul. I was more than a mother. I was a lawyer, a woman who knew how to dig, to fight, to refuse surrender. The pain of that loss became a forge, tempering me with the resolve to uncover the truth and reclaim my family. Looking back, I still feel the ache of those days, the sharp, raw grief, the humiliation and isolation. But I also recognize them as the beginning of my greatest battle, not just for Emily, but for myself. It was the moment when I stopped being afraid of losing everything and started becoming the woman my daughter believed I could be. If there's anything I believe now, it's this: even when life breaks you, your love can forge you into something stronger. And I would prove, for both of us, that we were worth fighting for. Refusing to give up, the first night without Emily was the quietest my house had ever been. It's almost funny, in a cruel way, how silence can feel so heavy. I wandered her empty room, tripping over scattered blocks and stuffed animals, wondering naively if I'd ever hear her laughter echo off those pastel walls again. I think grief has a taste. Sharp, metallic, bitter, at the root of the tongue. For a moment, longer than I care to admit, I considered simply giving up, letting the current take me wherever it might, shutting myself away from a world that no longer made sense. But then her words rang in my ears, a simple, earnest plea. "Don't forget to water my plant, Mommy." Even in her heartbreak, she'd trusted me with something fragile and hopeful. That was the spark, littler than a match head, but enough to coax me upright. I watered her plant, one small duty I could fulfill. Then, one by one, I started to reclaim other duties, other pieces of my life that Jack and his manufactured crisis hadn't managed to steal. At first, my refusal to quit felt more like habit than heroism. I went through the motions, waking at sunrise, making coffee, checking on the dozens of open files on my kitchen table. But as the days dragged into weeks, that stubbornness rooted itself deeper. I found myself thinking less of what I'd lost and more about what was still left to fight for. The ache of Emily's absence became a kind of armor, hardening me against the whispers in my office, the wary glances from old friends who didn't know how to comfort me. My enemies wanted me broken, retreating. What they got instead was a woman quietly assembling her tools for battle. Rediscovering my purpose, I reminded myself of who I was, The girl who worked her way through university serving coffee and cleaning dorm rooms. The young woman who'd stared down a room full of skeptics during her first trial. The mother who'd held Emily through fevers and midnight nightmares. My life, our life, was more complicated than a stack of doctored emails or a handful of slanderous statements. And that was something worth fighting for. I started with what I knew best, the law. It wasn't just a career. It was my compass, my language, the source of my first real confidence. I pored through every snippet of evidence Jack had submitted, looking for cracks. My nighttime rituals changed. There were fewer tears and more legal pads scrawled with timelines, call logs, and annotations. I set up a whiteboard in my living room, mapping out everything: dates, names, behaviors, inconsistencies. Emily would have loved the colored markers, the puzzle aspect of it all. In some strange way, it felt like we were still collaborating, still a team, reaching out for support. One lesson the crisis taught me quickly: pride is a luxury you can't always afford. I'd always wanted to be self-sufficient, the mythic single mom who never needed anything from anyone. But as the investigation grew, I realized I couldn't do this alone. My parents, always just a phone call away, doubled down on their support. Mom started dropping off home-cooked meals twice a week: lasagna, pot roast, enough for leftovers to get me through the hardest days. Dad, usually so reserved, volunteered to handle some of the logistical headaches, contacting witnesses, arranging for character references, driving me to hearings when I was too rattled to trust my own hands on the wheel. Linda Price, my attorney, became more than just legal counsel. She was my sounding board, my voice of reason. When I ranted about Jack's latest maneuver or doubted that the truth would ever matter, she'd talk me down and help me refocus. From her, I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply endure, one day, one breath, one hearing at a time. I leaned, too, on friends. While some had drawn back in the firestorm, others rallied. My neighbor, Kathy, started checking in after work, sometimes bringing fresh-baked muffins, sometimes just sitting quietly on the porch as I tried to stitch my fractured world back together, one silent sunset at a time. Investigative breakthroughs. The real turning point began with a small, almost missed detail. One afternoon, scanning through the office security logs, an advantage of befriending the right technical support staff years ago, I spotted an anomaly. Jack's access card had been used late at night, long past his usual hours, on nights when some of my files had mysteriously gone missing. I printed everything: logs, timestamps, even the security footage when I could get it. This alone wasn't enough to prove sabotage, but it reawakened the investigator in me. From there, I played to my strengths, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, corroborating stories. I quietly approached a paralegal who once seemed sympathetic to Jack's case. Over coffee, she hinted, nervously but distinctly, that she'd been pressured by Jack to keep an eye on me. I encouraged her gently, reminding her that she was protected by law. The door didn't fully open, but a crack of light shined through. Document by document, I rebuilt my own defense. I cross-referenced office emails, flagged suspicious edits in digital files, and compiled a list of times Jack had inserted himself into my cases under the guise of helping. I even found a software audit showing that key evidence in a major case file had been altered from his account, not mine. Outside the firm, I received a tip from an unexpected ally, a junior associate who'd recently resigned from the company. She told me that Jack had not only manipulated office politics, but had attempted to bribe her to back up his claims of my incompetence. Her email, sent late at night, was shaky and full of apologies. But it gave me a trail to follow. Battles in the courtroom and beyond. With each new piece of evidence, my resolve hardened. I became less afraid of my vulnerability and more curious about the truth, no matter how painful it would be to excavate. My meetings with Linda grew more strategic. We built a case not only for my parenting, but for myself as a victim of calculated workplace misconduct. Presenting this to the court and to the firm's ethics board was terrifying. There's something uniquely devastating about having to defend your competence, your character, and your love for your own child, all in the same breath. I spoke honestly, never overstating my weaknesses, but never hiding them either. I am not perfect, I remember telling the judge, but I am honest, and my only crime is loving my daughter enough to refuse to quit. That honesty, raw, imperfect, desperate, became my shield. There were setbacks. Some witnesses balked at testifying, fearing retribution, or simply wanting to protect their own careers. Opposing counsel tried to recast every delay or late-night email as proof of my instability. Jack, as always, seemed one step ahead, smiling, calm, almost bored with the proceedings. But slowly, the current began to shift. One former colleague, moved by my refusal to disparage Jack in front of Emily, agreed to write a letter attesting to my dedication as both a lawyer and a mother. Another, emboldened by the accumulating evidence, admitted to having witnessed Jack tampering with files. Personal growth amid the fight. In the midst of all this, I discovered things about myself I never knew. I am, to my core, resilient. Not because I never hurt, but because pain didn't stop me from showing up. My patience deepened. I learned to listen more, especially to Emily, whose questions cut deeper than any cross-examination. "Will you come to my soccer game, even if it's Dad's weekend?" she asked one night. My answer, "If you want me there, I'll never let you down." Publicly, my victories were small. An official agreeing to review evidence. A whispered apology from an old friend who doubted me. But privately, they restored something fundamental. At night, I scribbled letters to Emily she wouldn't read for years. Promises that I'd be there, that I believed in her, that loving her was my life's greatest honor. I boxed up her favorite books, one for each week apart, and asked Kathy to give her one at every Friday visit. The slow rebuilding of ritual. Sunday morning phone calls, care packages slipped into school backpacks, video chats that lasted for hours, threaded hope back into my days. Family, faith, and finding hope. I drew on the strength of my parents, who refused to let me wallow too long. "This is temporary," Mom repeated, until I almost believed it. Dad told me quiet stories of his own setbacks, reminding me, sometimes we win, not by being the fastest, but by being the last one standing. Their marriage, decades deep, taught me that loyalty isn't measured by ease, but by persistence. Faith, too, found its place. While I'd never been overtly religious, I started whispering prayers at night, less for miracles and more for courage. The strength to rise again tomorrow, whether I felt brave or not. In moments of darkness, I remembered holding Emily for the first time. The fierce determination coursing through me that I would protect her from anything. That resolve, once dormant, now set like steel in my bones. The spark of change. As weeks passed, cracks appeared in Jack's armor. The ethics board agreed to review my evidence. HR called a closed-door meeting to investigate irregularities in file access logs, and several colleagues admitted, under the protection of anonymity, to witnessing Jack's orchestrated campaign against me. It wasn't vindication. Not yet, but it was a start. Through it all, my relationship with Emily though strained by separation, became my driving force. She continued to trust me, even when adults failed her. "You're the bravest person I know," she whispered, sticky-fingered, over one of our weekend dinners. That undiluted faith reminded me why surrender was never an option. Every small action, every late night, every carefully assembled binder of evidence was an act of love, both for her and for the woman I was still becoming. I would not let betrayal set the terms of my story. Refusing to give up wasn't a single heroic act. It was 1,000 little choices: to investigate, to reach out, to forgive, to try again. It was the promise I made to Emily that sometimes, when the world takes everything, you fight back and you reclaim it, piece by precious piece. And in the process, I began to feel whole again, not despite the ordeal, but because of everything I was learning about resilience, justice, and the enduring, unbreakable bond of a mother and her child. The path of fighting back, they say, justice is slow, and they're right. But nobody really talks about how lonely it feels, waiting for the truth to rise over the horizon, like dawn, which may never come. At first, I saw my refusal to give up as a form of stubbornness. But over time, as my anger sharpened into focus and grief curdled into resolve, I realized I was gathering something stronger than mere defiance. I was arming myself for Emily, for my own redemption, for the foundations I refused to let Jack destroy. My counteroffensive, as I came to call it in the quiet corners of my mind, didn't spark to life overnight. It began with a whisper, one that grew into a voice, then a rallying cry. I saw myself as the lawyer and the mother, both, but most of all, I just wanted to be the truth teller. This would be a campaign, not a single skirmish, and I would need every scrap of tenacity if I hoped to win. Laying the groundwork. My first true act of resistance was simple but terrifying: recording and documenting everything. I started keeping a meticulous journal, logging dates, times, interactions, and subtle shifts in the office atmosphere. Who spoke to me? Who avoided my gaze? What files appeared out of place? Every email Jack sent on my behalf, I archived. Every sticky note, every time he offered to pitch in on a project I hadn't asked him for help with, I made note. Linda, my attorney, showed me how to back up work emails and retrieve deleted files within our firm's system. Some tricks, she joked, should be second nature to anyone who survived 3 years of law school. I laughed, sometimes, though more out of exhaustion than anything else. But gathering evidence wasn't just a technical exercise. It was emotional labor. Every time I unearthed a file that had been subtly edited or found my digital signature attached where it shouldn't have been, my gut clenched. I'd have to relive the humiliation of the hearing, the sense of betrayal, when even friendly faces in the firm began to avoid me in the hallways. Still, even in those moments of despair, I thought of Emily. I carried her picture, tucked behind my work ID. Her eyes seemed to remind me, "You don't quit, Mom. We're not built that way." Surveillance and subtlety. The next phase was riskier. With Linda's advice and a healthy sense of caution, I began clandestinely recording certain conversations with Jack, never straying from strict legal boundaries. Ohio's single-party consent law meant I could record as long as I was one of the participants, a small legal mercy. I hid a digital audio recorder in my purse, nervous at first that someone would find out. But the office had grown so polarized, so tense, that nobody noticed much anymore. It was chilling to listen to those conversations afterward. Jack performing empathy, professing concern about my well-being, then quietly steering conversations to touch on missed deadlines, lost files, and concerns the partners have raised. His words were always precise, never enough to be incriminating, yet always suggesting some invisible fire I was failing to put out. He'd learned the art of plausible deniability, wielding it like a weapon, only visible in shadow. Another break came from the IT angle, with help from the firm's sysadmin, who, years ago, I'd baked cookies for after a system crash. I gained access to deeper audit logs of the office network. I learned how to track at what times certain files were accessed and from which computers. Discrepancies emerged. Times when Jack's credentials accessed my client's folders at midnight, hours after I'd left the building, with the files being edited before a key piece went missing. I cross-referenced login times with building entry records from our security desk, a painstaking, tedious process. But after so much loss, I found it almost meditative. Every anomaly was a brick in the case I was building, a small assertion that my reality was not some paranoid fantasy. Pressure and allies. As weeks turned into months, momentum began to build in agonizing increments. A few colleagues started reaching out discreetly, never in the open, but in hushed tones in the parking garage, or a quietly slipped text message. One told me she'd been subtly pressured by Jack to keep an eye on me. Another confessed he'd been asked to double-check cases I'd already finalized, under the pretense of ensuring compliance. These whispers laid the foundation for witness statements, but everyone was scared. Scared of Jack, scared of the political fallout, scared for their own jobs. I didn't blame them. Even for me, each act of resistance was laced with anxiety. I knew I risked being seen as combative. Difficult. That loaded word, so often reserved for women who won't stay silent. I was keenly aware of every side-eye from senior partners, every staff, meeting where my suggestions were met with blank stares or quietly redirected to someone else. But there were allies, real ones, emerging from the fog. My neighbor, Kathy, kept her distance from the legal mess, but let me vent on her porch, nursing cheap wine from chipped mugs under the Ohio stars. My parents started attending more hearings, ready to testify for my character. Even Emily, in her own quiet way, would remind me, "Don't forget, you're my hero." Strategic legal moves with the pieces assembling, Linda and I began crafting a legal countermove with surgical precision. We started drafting motions to compel discovery from the firm, requests for security logs, keycard data, backup drives. Linda insisted we anticipate every denial, every loophole Jack might try to exploit. My apartment, once cluttered with Emily's toys, now looked like a war room. Whiteboards, timelines, folders labeled witnesses, and evidence potential. We planned every deposition as if it were a chess match. Linda coaxed our sympathetic colleagues to write affidavits, careful letters to the court, vouching for my work ethic, my reliability, and their suspicions about Jack's sudden office authority. My father wrote a character witness letter, describing my devotion to family, to justice, to never cutting corners even when it meant more work. When the day finally came to submit our first real brief to the court, detailing the mounting evidence of workplace sabotage, I felt a tremor of nerves and pride, adrenaline and doubt, but progress came with a price. Nightmares returned, memories of the day Emily was taken, of being eyed with pity and suspicion by people who'd once trusted me. Sleep was elusive. I started to rely on late-night runs through quiet Maplewood streets, the air biting at my skin to calm my racing mind. Court appearances felt like walking into hostile territory. Jack sat with his new girlfriend, immaculate, unbothered, as if none of this had anything to do with him. The biggest hurdle wasn't just proving what happened, but convincing others to care. The subtlety of professional sabotage is that it's so often invisible until someone connects the dots. In pretrial hearings, Jack's attorney tried to recast my accusations as paranoia, or worse, a bitter attempt to rewrite history after personal failure. I watched as even friendly judges hesitated, not wanting to be caught on the wrong side of an office feud. But I clung to each victory, no matter how small. When the court ordered our firm to turn over security footage, when one of Jack's supporters refused to perjure herself and withdrew a false statement, when IT logs unambiguously matched his logins to the Times files were tampered with. Each win was fuel, another step in the long climb, from victim to advocate. Emily, my guiding light. Amid the litigation storm, Emily remained at the center of my universe. Our visits were precious and sometimes wrenching. She'd come home with new worries, such as, "Dad says grown-ups always tell the truth, so why do people think you lied?" I would hold her, words sticking in my throat, and promise gently, "Sometimes adults make mistakes too, honey. The truth matters most in the end." I never let my bitterness about Jack touch her. My love for her became both sword and shield. She inspired me to keep our traditions alive, even through the grief. We'd bake cookies on weekends, talk to Grandma and Grandpa on FaceTime, draw silly monsters with extravagantly long tails. I wrote her letters every Sunday, slipped little notes into her backpack, tiny reminders that, even if she couldn't see it, I was still fighting for her with everything I had. Turning the tide. The crack in Jack's armor came from an unexpected angle. A junior associate, who'd once been eager to please Jack, resigned suddenly and reached out confidentially. She told me, the tone in her email shattered and afraid, that Jack had offered her a raise to back up certain claims about me, and she'd been too uncomfortable to go along. Now, outside the office's sphere of influence, she was willing to give a statement. That single act of courage triggered others. A paralegal admitted to forging one memo at Jack's insistence. Another staff member, seeing the tide turn, joined our list of witnesses. Linda and I compiled a new, damning brief. It documented not just the sabotage, but the pattern: attempts to influence witnesses, digital fingerprints on altered files, and a timeline that clearly showed I'd been set up to fail. We presented findings to my firm's ethics board and the court alike, applying steady, respectful pressure. But we did it all by the book, never stooping to rumor or personal attack, always double-checking every assertion. The emotional cost of justice. Fighting back took everything I had. I missed birthdays and dinners with Emily, spent too many nights hunched over transcripts, eyes bloodshot from screen glare. But my pride shifted. I stopped seeing this solely as rescue and started feeling it as reclamation. The process made me a fiercer mother and a keener lawyer. Slowly, confidence returned. Friends who'd once hesitated to stand by me sent messages of encouragement. Former rivals acknowledged my resilience with silent nods in the hallway. Therapy helped. I learned to name my anger, own my sadness without drowning in it. I forgave myself for not winning every battle, even moments of collapse. Mornings when I struggled to get out of bed, nights when the emptiness echoed, were, in a way, reminders of what I was fighting for. A world where Emily could trust the adults around her, where daughters believed their mothers and justice meant something concrete. Momentum builds. With the court revisiting our initial custody order, Jack finally faltered. His answers and depositions became evasive. His carefully constructed narrative began to unravel, especially as two more colleagues stepped forward to say under oath what he'd asked of them. My firm, to protect its own reputation, suspended Jack pending a full investigation, and I found myself surrounded again by tentative but genuine support. Linda and I presented the sum of our evidence for a judge's review. It was no longer just about winning back custody of Emily, or even restoring my career. Now I fought to clear my name, to ensure nobody could do to another woman what Jack had done to me. The final push, waiting for the court's decision, felt like holding my breath underwater. Emily seemed lighter, asking hopefully, "Is it almost over, Mom?" I whispered, "I hope so, baby. I hope so." And then, one bright morning, our case broke open completely. The court accepted our evidence, reopening the custody order and referring Jack for professional misconduct investigation. The partner who'd once doubted me shook my hand quietly and said simply, "I'm sorry." The vindication was real, but it was the knowledge that Emily would come home that meant everything. More than justice, fighting back taught me the limits of my endurance and the limits of injustice. I learned that truth might be quiet, but once it's assembled, piece by piece, it is impossible to ignore. For every tear and sleepless night, I earned something unbreakable, a new sense of self, a new chapter for me and Emily, and a voice I would never again let anyone silence. That was the journey of my counterattack, a marathon of faith, grit, love, and law, written not just in pleadings and emails, but in the ordinary rituals of hope we reweave when the world tries hardest to tear them apart. The truth unveiled. The day I stood before the company's ethics board, armed with thick stacks of evidence and a heart pounding so loudly it echoed in my ears, I understood in a visceral way what people mean by a fight or flight moment. It didn't matter how many late nights Linda and I had painstakingly cataloged files and testimonies, or how many times I'd replayed Jack's whispered manipulations in secret recordings. Now, I had to trust that truth, methodical, patient, and often frustratingly slow, would finally surface and speak for itself. The room was stiff and clinical. Jack sat at the far end of the long table, his posture straight, face unreadable. Across from me were partners who had once greeted me warmly in the halls, now forced into a difficult reckoning of their own actions, of their silence, and of the web of deception that had nearly destroyed my professional life. I began with a trembling voice, but, as my narrative unwound, I felt a familiar steadiness return. I walked them step by step through the timeline, the unexplained revisions of sensitive files, the manipulation of client correspondence, the late-night office entries captured on security logs. I presented witness statements, sworn affidavits from colleagues who described Jack's pressure campaigns and IT records confirming unauthorized access. At first, the questions were sharp, almost skeptical. Could this have been a system glitch? Was it possible for another staffer to use Jack's credentials? Linda and I answered calmly, never overreaching, never emotional. We had done our homework, double and triple checked every assertion. As the hours passed, grains of doubt gave way to growing horror among the panel. The evidence was overwhelming, and, for the first time in many agonizing months, I saw apology flicker in the expressions of people who had looked away when I'd needed them most. When the board called a recess to deliberate, I sat outside in the corridor, hugging myself. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. The wheels of justice rarely turn as swiftly as you want. But something had shifted. The firm, desperate now to preserve its own reputation, launched a formal investigation into Jack's conduct. HR conducted closed-door interviews and scoured months of old digital records. I went from being invisible or suspicious to a reluctant focal point. People who had steered wide around me in the halls began to nod, some quietly apologizing for not testing the assumptions they'd so easily accepted at my expense. Meanwhile, Jack's veneer of calm began to splinter. He grew tight-lipped and irritable, circling the periphery of the firm, but no longer holding court in break rooms or staff meetings. News spread quickly that he'd been asked to take a leave of absence pending investigation. It wasn't public humiliation. Corporate culture tends to keep its dramas politely muffled, but it was a reversal so complete I barely recognized the world I was living in. My work life, once a source of humiliation, became a space of cautious restoration. Colleagues started sharing workloads again, joking in the kitchen, asking my advice as if a long mental fog had lifted. My own confidence, battered for so long, returned by degrees. Each new acknowledgement, each tentative gesture of friendship was like a salve. Linda and I began to prepare a supplemental brief, this time with the support of the firm's legal department. No longer David and Goliath. Now there were other Davids standing with me. The court's response moved as slowly as any legal process, but with the avalanche of new evidence, the judge ordered the custody decision to be re-examined. For the first time in so many months, I could look Emily in the eyes and promise, "We have a real chance, sweetheart." Her smile, relieved, uncertain, but so achingly hopeful, became the fuel I needed for the final stretch. The day of the custody hearing, I felt my hands steady as I dressed Emily in her favorite skirt, zipped my own suit jacket, and watched my parents climb into the gallery. The testimony read more like a crime thriller than a custody dispute. Emails, logs, even Jack's own voice clipped from my recordings as he slyly offered to help clean up another of my cases. My allies, once fearful witnesses, rose to back my version of the story, some even at risk to their own careers. When the judge leaned forward, his voice as even and formal as ever, and said, "Given the evidence of professional misconduct and deliberate sabotage, I am restoring primary custody to the petitioner, Jenny Carter, effective immediately." I felt the tides of the universe shift. Tears flooded down my face as Emily hugged me so tightly my ribs ached. I looked back at my parents, their faces shining with pride and relief, and caught Linda grinning at me, eyes crinkled, finally shedding her lawyer's armor for a moment of genuine joy. But the impact stretched beyond the courtroom. The firm's decision was swift. Jack's employment was terminated, and his legal standing came under review. It seemed almost surreal. Months spent doubting the solidity of reality, now suddenly vindicated. Cynics might say there was no true justice. After all, I could never get back the lost months or erase the hurt. But for me, the chance to walk into my home, holding Emily's hand, was a miracle of its own. Her room, long dormant, was brought to life again with giggles and bedtime stories, with the sun streaming in illuminating dust motes that danced like little celebrations in the air. The truth, once so elusive, had finally come to light, and with it, my sense of self returned. I wasn't just the woman nearly undone by malice and betrayal. I was now also the woman who stood her ground, restored her family, and reminded everyone around her, including herself, that justice might be slow, but it is relentless. Looking back, I felt an odd gratitude, even for the struggle. The ordeal had given me a deeper perspective on the way systems can fail and the necessity of perseverance. It rebuilt my faith in the small acts of everyday solidarity, of friends making testimony, a neighbor's casserole, a simple text from my mom, that pushed back against the cruelty of indifference. Most of all, I saw Emily, resilient, bright, unbowed, thriving. She came back to me, not broken by the journey, but stronger for having witnessed her mother refuse to surrender. In the story she would tell years from now, I hoped the truth she remembered would not just be about the wrongs of the world, but the ways we can put things right if we fight hard enough and never stop believing in the power of our own voice. The truth, once buried by lies, had been unearthed, and in that daylight, my family and I finally moved forward, hope shimmering on the horizon once again. Happiness returns. Winning Emily back was not the sort of victory immortalized in movies, a burst of confetti and a final sweep of triumphant music. It was, instead, a gentle blooming, slow as spring in Maplewood. For a whole season after the court's decision, it felt like I was learning how to breathe again, discovering what happiness really meant. Something far more fragile and precious than I remembered. Bringing Emily home that first weekend, my hands shook as I helped her carry her backpack and a box of treasures through the door of our new apartment. Our old place carried too many ghosts, and though money was tight, we found a cozy complex on the edge of town. It wasn't much. Scuffed floors, thrift store couches, hand-me-down kitchenware, but it was ours. As we unlocked the door together, the late afternoon sun warmed the living room and cast a soft glow over the empty shelves and bare walls, waiting to be filled once again with the life we'd lost and were determined to reclaim. Emily ran from room to room, exclaiming over the view of the playground outside, claiming the smaller bedroom for herself, then quickly changing her mind and choosing the bigger one. So I can have all my books too, not just the ones from Dad's. She placed her frayed pink bunny on the windowsill and announced, "He likes to watch the birds." Hearing her laughter echo in this fresh space, some knot inside me loosened. Still, it wasn't all easy. For weeks, Emily's routines carried a skittish energy. She hesitated when I suggested reading together at bedtime, as if afraid I might suddenly disappear. Sometimes she'd slip questions into her chatter. "Will you always be here after school now?" As if needing daily reassurance. I answered every time, "I'll always be here, sweetheart. I promise." The words became my mantra. Evening after evening, we reclaimed the small rituals that had once defined our days. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, sidewalk chalk drawings under the trees, new inside jokes whispered over cups of hot chocolate. I realized quickly that healing demanded patience, not just on Emily's part, but mine as well. I caught myself watching her too closely, interpreting every quiet moment or sigh as worry or fear. I had to learn to let her be, to trust our new life, and let laughter return naturally. Our little apartment became a testimony to resilience. We hung up Emily's drawings on the refrigerator, framed a photo of the two of us from her school play, and filled a box with letters and postcards she'd sent between our visits. Sometimes, when I was alone, I opened that box and traced her fledgling scrawl, remembering all the nights I wrote her replies, trying to keep hope alive for both of us. And then there was my own healing. For so long, I had lived in fight or flight, too exhausted to do anything except prepare for the next crisis. Now, with the dust settling, I faced a different kind of challenge. The quiet, persistent ache that comes after surviving a storm. My therapist helped me see that restoration didn't mean pretending nothing happened. I was allowed to grieve the months we lost and to get angry at the laughter Jack had tried to take from our home. "Happiness isn't a finish line," she told me one afternoon. "It's made of all the little choices to stay present, even when it hurts." At work, I was surprised by the tentativeness of my return. The partners who once doubted me now treated me with wariness tinged with respect. uncertain how to welcome me back, but unwilling to repeat old mistakes. I eased into a new normal, accepting smaller cases at first, rebuilding my confidence in the simple rhythms of research and client meetings. A handful of colleagues approached me quietly, apologizing for having believed Jack's manufactured truths. I nodded. Some wounds ran deeper than words. But forgiveness, I realized, was a gift I needed to give, if only for myself. In time, I even found laughter again in the break room. An intern's awkward joke, the furious debates over the best coffee shop in Columbus. Outside of work, my parents continued to be my anchor. Mom's casseroles found their way into my freezer, and Dad set up weekend projects, putting together bookshelves, assembling Emily's battered bicycle. Their presence was steadfast, but never smothering, understanding when we needed space to simply be a family of two, and when loneliness pressed in too tightly, they filled in the edges with warmth. Kathy, our neighbor from before, visited on the weekends with fresh baked bread and an endless supply of encouragement. She and Emily planted a row of sunflowers outside our stoop, watching them grow through spring. I found a metaphor for everything we'd survived. Fragile shoots, battered by wind and rain, determined to reach the light. Among the most beautiful changes was the evolution of my relationship with Emily. In the aftermath of trauma, sometimes I worried our closeness had been forever shaken. But as weeks passed, I saw her confidence return. She threw herself into her new school, earning the part of the mischievous fox in the spring play. At home, she sprawled on the floor with glue sticks and colored paper, producing cards for every person she cared about. Her grandparents, her friends, even Linda, my attorney, because she's brave like us. As summer approached, we created our own traditions. Movie nights camped out on the living room floor, backyard picnics in nearby parks, reading challenges, where we competed to see who could read the silliest story with the straightest face. We laughed so hard some nights that I thought my heart would burst. Not everything was fixed, of course. There were times when the old anxieties crept in, parent-teacher conferences that left me holding my breath, or evenings when Emily would grow quiet and ask hard questions about her father. I never lied, but I chose kindness in my answers. Your dad and I both love you, I said, even when it cost me, because I hoped compassion would offer a bridge instead of building more walls. Slowly, I forged a new understanding of happiness in my own life. It wasn't about having everything perfect. Far from it. There were still bills to juggle, unexpected, breakdowns, literally and emotionally, and the lingering doubt that accompanied every new challenge. But joy had become something woven into our everyday moments. Emily studying at the kitchen table, the smell of cinnamon rolls on Saturday, the slow contentment that filled me as I watched her sleep safe in her bed at night. I also found meaning in helping others. My experience left me with empathy for those caught in the crosshairs of injustice, especially mothers fighting silent battles. I volunteered at a local legal aid clinic during my evenings, offering advice to women who couldn't afford an attorney but deserved to be heard. Each victory, however small, an unfair eviction overturned, a restraining order granted, became part of my own healing, proof that brokenness didn't have to be permanent. Through this, I rediscovered not only my courage, but my voice. Emily, watching me forge a path from sorrow to hope, grew bolder as well. She wrote stories in her journal about brave families and magical forests, sometimes reading them aloud, sometimes tucking them into my purse as little surprises for tough days. There were unexpected gifts as well. My circle of friends shrank, but became truer. Friends like Kathy showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I built new friendships with other single parents and with volunteers at the clinic. Even Linda, once just my attorney, became a confidant with whom I could share both frustration and laughter. Most days, the happiness we stitched together seemed ordinary from the outside, small, imperfect, full of repetition. But for us, each routine was rebirth. Our lives weren't just restored, they were transformed. And yet, despite the forward momentum, some nights I'd sit on the balcony and look up at the star-scattered sky, thinking about the alternate lives we might have had. There was sadness and anger and loss, but there was also understanding of the depth of my love for Emily, of my capacity to endure, of the beauty of new beginnings at any age. As the first anniversary of Emily's homecoming approached, she suggested we throw a Happy New Home party. Together, we baked cupcakes and invited the friends and family who had carried us through the darkness. That evening, our apartment glowed with laughter and warmth, the walls finally echoing with the life they were meant to shelter. When the guests had gone and Emily drifted off to sleep, I sat on her bed, tracing the outline of her hand on a sheet of construction paper, one of our earliest rituals. I thought about the meaning of happiness, not as an arrival, but as a journey, a choice, renewed every day, sometimes every breath. "I love you, Emily," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for teaching me how to hope again." In the quiet that followed, I realized happiness had not just returned. It had been remade, shaped by struggle and resilience into something deeper and truer than before. And as the first light of morning crept into our window, I knew, whatever storms may come, we would weather them together, hearts wide open to the fragile, fierce joy of the life we had fought so hard to reclaim.